They say the cruelest betrayals don't come from enemies, they come from the people you call family. I learned that the day I buried my grandfather and discovered that everything he had promised me, everything he had built for me, had been stolen. Not by strangers, not by outsiders, but by the three people who should have loved me the most, my own parents and my younger sister. One moment, I was the heir to a $10 million fortune and the CEO in waiting of a shipping empire. The next, I was dragged across the marble floor of my childhood home by my hair and thrown into the street with nothing but the clothes on my back. Sit back, relax, and stay with me until the very end of this story. Because what started as the darkest moment of my life became the turning point that transformed me forever. My name is Catherine Harrison. I'm 29 years old, and until recently, I believed my life was secure. My grandfather, Edward Harrison, raised me to carry on his legacy. He was more than a grandfather, he was my mentor, my hero, the man who taught me how to read a balance sheet before I could drive, and how to see opportunity in every setback. For years he made it clear. I wasn't just his granddaughter, I was his successor. One day, Harrison Shipping, the company he had built with his bare hands, would be mine to lead. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? He had never broken a promise before. He gave me every tool to succeed: knowledge, discipline, courage. When he spoke about the future, it was always our future. And then, just when I thought everything we had worked for was finally coming together, he was taken from me. And with him went everything I thought I knew about loyalty, blood, and family. Because when the will was read, it wasn't my name on the fortune, it wasn't my name on the company. It was my younger sister Sophia, the girl who had spent her life tanning by pools and shopping on Michigan Avenue. And my father, Thomas, the man who had spent years resenting me for being the grandchild his own father-in-law admired more than him, was named interim CEO. My mother, Evelyn, with her perfect dresses and carefully practiced smile, stood by them both, as if I had never existed at all. I thought it was a mistake. I thought someone would correct it. But when I stood up and demanded answers, I was told to sit down. When I tried to take my belongings from my childhood room, I was accused of stealing. And when I refused to let go, my father's hands gripped my hair and dragged me across the floor like I was a criminal, not his daughter. Tell me, have you ever been betrayed by the very people who were supposed to protect you? Have you ever looked into the eyes of your family and realized you were nothing more than an obstacle in their way? Leave me a comment, because I want to hear your story too. I was left with nothing, no inheritance, no job, no home, no family. But what my parents and sister didn't understand was that my grandfather had prepared me for this exact moment. In his final days, he left me clues that would expose the lies, uncover the truth, and turn the power back into my hands. So, don't just listen to this story. Like this video if you believe that betrayal can become the spark for something greater. Subscribe if you want to follow every twist and turn of how I fought back against the people who tried to destroy me. Because this isn't just a story about money or power, it's about resilience, justice, and the strength to rise when everything you thought you could trust has been ripped away. And that night, standing alone on the street outside the house I had called home for 29 years, I made myself a promise. This was not the end of my story. This was the beginning. Let me take you back to where it all started with my grandfather, Edward Harrison, the man who saw my future long before I ever did. I was never supposed to be ordinary. At least, that's what my grandfather, Edward Harrison, always told me. From the time I was old enough to walk into his office, he treated me like I belonged in boardrooms instead of playgrounds. While other kids were learning multiplication tables, I was learning how to calculate profit margins. While they were riding bikes, I was sitting across from my grandfather at the long oak dining table as he explained international shipping routes with the same ease. Most people explain a recipe. He never talked down to me, never softened his words as though I was too young to understand. He spoke to me like a future equal, like someone who would one day sit where he, Saturday. And I believed him. Because when he looked at me, I could see it. In his eyes he wasn't imagining possibilities. He was stating facts. My grandfather's story was the kind people put in business magazines. He was the son of immigrants who arrived in Chicago with little more than determination and a willingness to work harder than anyone else. He started Harrison Shipping with a single truck and a rented office near the South Side. By the time I was born, the company had expanded into a multi-million-dollar logistics empire, stretching across the Midwest, with headquarters in a glass and steel tower downtown. To most people, he was a legend. To me, he was simply Grandpa Edward, the man who took my hand every Sunday morning and led me down to the shores of Lake Michigan. Those mornings were sacred. We rarely caught much, but that wasn't the point. He'd bait my hook, and then sit beside me in silence, the cool wind off the water ruffling his silver hair. Sometimes we'd go an entire hour without speaking, until suddenly he'd tell me about the time he lost an important contract and nearly bankrupted the company, or the day he convinced a skeptical bank to give him a loan by promising collateral he didn't actually have. "The key, Katie," he'd say, his voice low and steady, "isn't never failing. It's learning how to rise after you've been knocked flat. Most people stay down. Leaders get back up." I absorbed every word, every lesson, storing them in the deepest corners of my memory. It wasn't just business advice, it was survival advice. And though I didn't know it then, those lessons would be the only thing that kept me alive when everything else was ripped away. During summer breaks, I begged him to take me to the Harrison Shipping offices. Most kids dreaded being dragged to work with their parents, not me. The first time I walked through those glass doors, I felt like I had stepped into the future. The smell of fresh coffee, the low hum of phones ringing, the whiteboards filled with numbers and maps, all of it felt like home. Grandpa would let me sit quietly in the corner of his office during meetings, and afterward he'd ask me what I thought. At 10 years old, I told him one of his managers had seemed nervous when discussing costs, and a week later that same manager resigned after being caught in a lie. Grandpa never laughed at me, never dismissed me. He'd just smile, his eyes crinkling. "Sharp as a knife, this one," he'd say to his colleagues. "She'll run this place one day." By 16, I could read a balance sheet better than most business school graduates. Numbers spoke to me the way music speaks to others. I could see patterns, anticipate risks, and propose solutions that made even seasoned employees nod in respect. Word spread through the company that I was the heir apparent. People whispered it when I walked into the room. "That's Catherine, the future of Harrison Shipping." I remember one evening in particular, when I was 17. We were in his library, a sprawling room with floor-to-ceiling shelves crammed with biographies, economic textbooks, and volumes of philosophy. He poured me a glass of soda in a heavy crystal tumbler, his own filled with bourbon, and told me to sit across from him at the desk. "Look around you," he said, gesturing to the shelves, the polished wood, the history of his life. "All of this will be yours one day, not because you're my granddaughter, but because you've earned it. You have what this family needs to survive. Don't ever doubt that." I didn't. How could I? He had never lied to me before. Still, there were cracks in the picture-perfect future. My father, Thomas, was already the company's chief financial officer, but I could sense his resentment. Every time Grandpa praised me, I saw the flicker of anger in my father's eyes. It was subtle, but it was there, the tightening of his jaw, the way his hands clenched just slightly when someone called me the future. I was too young to name it, but I knew it wasn't love. My mother, Evelyn, rarely hid her disappointment either. "Why don't you go shopping with Sophia?" she'd ask, her voice clipped when I came home in slacks and a button-down instead of a dress. "A girl your age should be focused on enjoying herself, not running around with numbers and files." But I didn't care. I wasn't chasing their approval. My purpose was bigger, clearer. I wanted to be worthy of the man who believed in me more than anyone else. By the time I turned 29, I had made it. At least, I thought I had. I was chief operating officer, running day-to-day operations. The employees respected me not because of my last name, but because I had started in the mailroom, worked late nights without complaint, and proved I was willing to get my hands dirty. The clients trusted me, because I kept promises and delivered results. Grandpa introduced me at industry dinners as the future of Harrison Shipping, and nobody questioned it. But the higher I rose, the more I felt the tension at home growing. My father's questions at dinner turned into pointed attacks. "Do you really think expanding into South America is wise, given the instability?" he'd ask, his tone sharp. I would explain the numbers, the contingency plans, the opportunities. He'd shake his head and say, "We'll see what Edward thinks." But Edward had already approved my strategies. And Sophia would sit across the table, smirking into her wine glass, enjoying the spectacle of my humiliation. I told myself it didn't matter, that as long as I had Grandpa's trust, nothing else could touch me. He had promised me the company, and promises from Edward Harrison were ironclad. What I didn't see, what I couldn't see, was how much that very promise had poisoned the rest of my family. How my father's resentment had hardened into hatred. How my mother's shallow ambition had found a new target in the company. How Sophia, spoiled and shallow though she was, had begun to see Harrison Shipping as her ticket to legitimacy. I thought the future was mine. I thought the legacy was secure. I couldn't have been more wrong. Because while I was busy proving myself at the office, my family was quietly building a plan to cut me out of everything I had worked for. And the storm that would destroy my world was already gathering on the horizon. Family dinners in my house were not places of comfort. They were battlegrounds dressed up in fine china and silverware, staged in a dining room where the chandelier sparkled brighter than any warmth in my parents' eyes. I used to wonder if other families sat around their tables laughing, talking about their days, or if those picture-perfect moments only existed in television commercials. For us, meals were interrogations, carefully orchestrated by my father to remind me of my place, or rather, the place he wanted me to occupy. Thomas Harrison, my father, was a man who lived in the shadow of another. I understand that now, but as a child, I only sensed the tension, the resentment that seemed to leak out of him whenever I was praised. For more than 30 years, he had worked at Harrison Shipping as the chief financial officer, yet he was never the visionary, never the strategist, never the leader my grandfather was. He was competent, yes, precise with numbers, meticulous with reports, but to my grandfather, competence was the bare minimum. What mattered was foresight, courage, the ability to take risks and steer the company forward. And in those qualities, my father came up short. He knew it. I knew it. And worst of all, my grandfather knew it too. That knowledge curdled inside him. It poisoned him. I could see it in the way he glared across the table when Grandpa praised me for closing a deal or managing a project. His words would cut, delivered with the sharpness of a knife but disguised as concern. One evening, not long before everything unraveled, he leaned forward at the table, his wine glass reflecting the chandelier's light, and said, "Do you really think expanding into South America is wise, Catherine? Political instability, unreliable infrastructure seems reckless." His tone was deceptively casual, but it wasn't a question, it was a challenge. I had spent weeks running the numbers, building contingency plans, researching market volatility. I answered calmly, explaining the potential for growth, the safety nets I had built, the strategies in place to mitigate risk. My heart hammered, but my voice was steady. He only smirked, leaned back, and said, "We'll see what Edward thinks." He already knew my grandfather had approved the plan, but it didn't matter. He wasn't testing my proposal, he was testing me. And across the table, Sophia hid her smile behind the rim of her glass, enjoying every second of my discomfort. Sophia. My younger sister, 4 years behind me in age, but treated as if she had been born carrying a crown. If I was forged in the fire of discipline and expectation, she was wrapped in silk and handed everything she wanted. My mother adored her, doted on her, defended her at every turn. "Not everyone needs to be a workaholic," Evelyn would say, when I dared to point out that Sophia hadn't held a job for more than 2 weeks. "Sophia has other talents." Those talents included spending obscene amounts of money on clothes, curating her Instagram feed, and attaching herself to men who had more ambition in their bank accounts than she ever showed in her own life. Yet somehow, she was the golden child. When she walked into a room in one of her carefully chosen outfits, my mother would beam with pride. When I returned from the office late, still in my suit, exhausted but exhilarated from another victory at work, my mother would purse her lips and ask why I couldn't look more presentable. It didn't matter that I was keeping the company running. In her eyes, what mattered was how Sophia dazzled at cocktail parties. My mother, Evelyn, had been a beauty queen once. That crown never left her head, not really. She had married into the Harrison family with her sights set on status, and everything in her life revolved around appearances. She curated her world like an art gallery. Every dinner party a performance, every conversation another step up the social ladder. She believed image was everything, and Sophia was her masterpiece. I was her disappointment. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from sitting at a table with your own blood and realizing you are the outsider. I learned early on that my efforts, my achievements, would never win me their affection, and so, I stopped trying. I poured everything into my grandfather and the company, because that was where I found value, where I was seen. But even as I did, I could feel the air in our home shifting. The more responsibility my grandfather handed me at Harrison Shipping, the more hostile my father became. His criticisms turned sharper, more public. He began questioning me not in private, but in front of Sophia, as if turning her into his audience gave his words more weight. My mother, of course, sided with him. And Sophia, spoiled as she was, leaned back and reveled in the spectacle. It wasn't just at dinner. I began to notice hushed conversations between my parents when they thought I wasn't listening. I'd walk into a room, and they'd fall silent. Sometimes I'd catch Sophia smirking as though she knew something I didn't. Once, I found my mother in the library, a place she had never cared about, flipping through financial records she clearly didn't understand. "Just curious," she said lightly when I asked what she was doing. But the look in her eyes told me it was more than curiosity. The storm was brewing. I should have seen it. I should have known that their sudden interest in the company, their private conversations, their sharpened barbs were leading somewhere darker. But I was blinded by purpose. I believed if I worked harder, if I proved myself more, then the future would remain as clear as it had always been. Harrison Shipping would be mine, as my grandfather had promised. The night before my 29th birthday, I sat alone in my room, reviewing a proposal for a major retail partnership. My phone buzzed with a message from Sophia. "Try not to embarrass us tomorrow." No explanation, just those words. I stared at the screen, my pulse quickening. Something in her tone was different. Not teasing, not petty, but almost triumphant. At the time, I brushed it off as another jab. I told myself she was jealous, insecure, desperate to cut me down. I didn't realize that those words were the tip of the knife already pressing against my back. What I couldn't see then was how deep the cracks in my family had become, how carefully they were preparing to shatter everything I had built with my grandfather. The dinner table battles were only rehearsals. The real war was waiting, just out of sight. And it began on the day my grandfather collapsed in his office. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday, a day that should have blended into the dozens of others I spent at Harrison Shipping. I had just come from a meeting about a major retail partnership, carrying a folder of contracts I was eager to review with my grandfather. He always insisted that before any major deal crossed his desk, I should give it a thorough examination first. It wasn't just a matter of trust, it was training. He wanted me to see the details, to feel the weight of the choices that shaped our company. I still remember the hush of the hallway as I walked toward his office. Employees smiled at me, the way they always did, murmuring quiet hellos, acknowledging me not only as Edward Harrison's granddaughter but as the future of the company. I held my head high, but inside I felt the familiar blend of pride and pressure. I wanted to make him proud. I wanted to prove, once again, that he hadn't chosen the wrong heir. I pushed open the heavy oak door to his office, ready to hear his gravelly voice calling me, "Katie," ready to sit across from him with our papers spread between us. But instead, the sound that met me was silence. And then I saw him. My grandfather was on the floor, his body slumped awkwardly, his breathing shallow and uneven. The sight paralyzed me for half a heartbeat, then panic seized me. The folder slipped from my hands as I dropped to my knees beside him, shouting his name, shaking his shoulder. His eyes fluttered, his lips moved, but no words came out. My hands trembled as I dialed 911, my voice breaking as I begged for an ambulance. Time warped. Seconds stretched into eternities as I pressed my palm against his chest, whispering to him, pleading with him to stay with me. By the time the paramedics arrived, I was numb, my world already unraveling. The ride to the hospital blurred into fragments, the flashing lights, the antiseptic smell, the sound of machines I didn't understand. I sat there, clutching his hand, praying, bargaining with God, telling myself he had to survive. He was invincible, wasn't he? The man who had built an empire out of nothing, who had carried me on his shoulders, who had promised me the future he couldn't leave me. At the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota, the doctor's words cut through me like knives. Yes, he suffered a stroke, one of them said gently. But that's not the only concern. They exchanged glances, the kind that said more than words ever could. Then came the truth. Advanced pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. It had spread to his liver. 6 months at most. The room spun. My ears roared. I tried to focus, tried to argue, tried to insist they run more tests, bring in specialists, try experimental treatments. But deep down, I saw the truth in their faces. My grandfather, my rock, my mentor, the man who seemed eternal, was dying. When he woke, his voice was weaker than I had ever heard, but his eyes, those sharp, steel-gray eyes, still burned with clarity. He asked for me, only me. My parents hovered, but when he insisted, they left the room reluctantly. "Catherine," he whispered, gripping my hand with surprising strength. "Listen carefully. Things are going to get complicated. Trust only what I've told you directly. Remember our lake." My throat closed. I shook my head, tears blurring my vision. "No, don't talk like that. You'll fight this. We'll get you the best doctors, the best treatments. You'll beat this." A sad smile tugged at his lips. "I've lived a good life, my dear. Built something that will outlast me. But I need to make sure it passes to the right hands." He paused, his eyes boring into mine. "Promise me you'll be strong. Promise me you won't let them take it from you." My chest ached, but I forced the words out. "I promise. I'll protect it. I'll protect everything you built." He squeezed my hand, closing his eyes as if the effort of speaking had drained him. I sat there, watching the rise and fall of his chest, trying to etch every detail into my memory, the lines on his face, the way his hand dwarfed mine, the warmth of his skin. I wanted to freeze the moment, to hold on to him forever. But time doesn't stop. Over the following days, I practically lived in that hospital room. I brought work with me, determined to keep Harrison Shipping moving, as if my diligence could hold the world together. We talked about contracts, employees, and expansion plans, but he also spoke of regrets, of choices he wished he'd made differently. He told me stories I had never heard, about the sacrifices he made in the early years, the friendships lost, the sleepless nights, and always, beneath his words, was the unspoken truth. He was preparing me for life without him. What unsettled me most wasn't just his decline, but the sudden transformation of my family. My mother, who had barely visited him in the hospital before, suddenly appeared daily with homemade soup, fussing over him as if she had always been the dutiful daughter-in-law. My father began bringing financial documents into the room, asking him to sign, closing the door whenever I entered. Even Sophia started showing up, wearing conservative clothes I had never seen her in, asking Grandpa questions about the company she had ignored her entire life. It felt like a performance, like actors rehearsing for roles they were never meant to play. But the worst part was that my access to him began to shrink. Nurses, apparently under instructions, told me he was sleeping whenever I arrived, though I could see him awake and talking to my father through the crack of the door. I started to feel like an intruder in a place that had once been mine. One afternoon, I caught his longtime attorney, James Thornton, leaving the room. He had been our family lawyer for decades. His face was unreadable, but when I asked what was happening, he only said, Just updating some paperwork. Nothing to worry about. Yet something in his eyes betrayed unease. When I went in, Grandpa forced a smile, but his eyes carried a weight I couldn't ignore. "Don't worry about the legal details," he told me softly. "I'm making sure you're taken care of." But I didn't believe him, not fully. There was a tension in the room, a heaviness between us that had never existed before. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. The night before his decline worsened, he called me close. His voice was barely a whisper. "Remember our fishing spot? And your favorite book in my library? The answers you'll need are there." I didn't understand, but I nodded, tears spilling down my face. "I love you, Grandpa." "I love you too, my brave girl," he murmured. Then, with the last of his strength, he added, "Be careful with the family, Catherine. Sometimes the people closest to us can hurt us the most." Those were the last clear words he ever spoke to me. Within days, he slipped into a coma. And just like that, the man who had shaped my life, who had built my future, was gone. I stood by his bed, numb with grief, unaware that my family had already begun rewriting the script of my life. What I didn't yet realize was that his warning wasn't about distant threats, it was about the people standing right beside me. And their betrayal was already in motion. The week after my grandfather's funeral felt like a blur of black dresses, handshakes, and empty condolences. The service at Holy Name Cathedral in Chicago had been magnificent, filled with people who owed their careers, their livelihoods, even their sense of identity to Edward Harrison. To them, he was a titan. To me, he was the man who tucked me into bed with stories about persistence, who taught me that numbers could tell the truth if you knew how to read them. Standing at his graveside, clutching the fishing lure I had hidden in my pocket, I felt like the world had been ripped from me. But the true earthquake hadn't even struck yet. 1 week later, we gathered in the office of James Thornton, my grandfather's attorney of over 20 years. I had known James since I was a child. His voice had always carried a kind of steady assurance, the sort of man who made you feel that order and reason would prevail. That morning, though, as I sat in the leather chair across from him, I noticed something different. His hands trembled slightly when he shuffled the papers in front of him. His eyes flickered toward me, then away, as if he couldn't bear to hold my gaze. The conference room felt too cold, the air too heavy. My parents sat together, perfectly composed. My mother wore a black dress that looked like it had been chosen more for a photo shoot than mourning, her pearls catching the light. My father's face was impassive, his eyes sharp and unreadable. Sophia sat beside them, her legs crossed, her phone resting on the table, though for once she wasn't scrolling. She wore a designer dress that clung to her like armor, her expression poised, almost smug. I sat alone on the other side of the table, clutching my grandfather's last letter in my purse. My chest tightened as James cleared his throat. "Before I begin," he said softly, "let me express my condolences once again. Edward was not just a client, but a dear friend." My father leaned forward. "Thank you, James. Let's get to it." And with that, James opened the folder. His voice wavered only slightly as he read the opening line. "I, Edward Harrison, being of sound mind and body, do hereby revoke all previous wills and testaments." The words sliced through me. Revoke? My heart pounded in my ears. My grandfather had shown me his will years ago, had made me his heir without hesitation. He had told me it was ironclad. He had promised. And now, with a single sentence, everything I thought I knew about my future collapsed. James continued, but his voice seemed far away, muffled by the ringing in my ears. "The entirety of my estate, including financial assets valued at $10 million and controlling shares in Harrison Shipping, I bequeath to my granddaughter Sophia Harrison." The room tilted. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at James, waiting for him to correct himself, to laugh and say it was all some terrible clerical mistake, but he didn't. He just kept reading, each word a nail in the coffin of the life I had built. "To my son-in-law, Thomas Harrison, I appoint the role of interim CEO and guardian of Sophia's business interests until she acquires sufficient experience to assume leadership of the company." And then, almost as an afterthought, James said, To my granddaughter Catherine Harrison, I leave this personal letter to be read in private. He slid a sealed envelope across the table toward me. My hands shook as I picked it up. This couldn't be real. My grandfather, the man who had trained me, mentored me, loved me like no one else, would never have done this. He couldn't have given everything to Sophia, who had never lifted a finger, never cared about the business, who only knew the company as the source of her credit cards and luxury vacations. I turned to my parents, searching their faces for some sign of honesty, of reassurance. But my father only leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Your grandfather made his own decisions," he said evenly. Perhaps he finally realized who truly had the company's best interests at heart. My mother's lips curled into a sharp smile. "Or perhaps he saw that you were too controlling, too rigid." Sophia smirked, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "You always thought you were the chosen one. Guess he had other plans." Anger and grief crashed through me in waves. I slammed the envelope on the table. "This is a fraud. Grandpa would never have done this. I'll contest it. I'll prove it's fake." James shifted uncomfortably. "The will was signed and witnessed 3 weeks before Edward's passing. I can only read what is legally before me." I turned on my parents. "What did you do to him? What did you say when you kept me out of that hospital room?" My father's face darkened, his voice low. "Careful, Catherine. You're treading on dangerous ground." I wanted to scream, to tear the papers from James's hands and burn them. But instead, I sat frozen, my mind racing. My grandfather's warning echoed in my ears. "Trust only what I've told you directly. Remember our lake." The meeting ended in silence. My father rose smoothly, already assuming the role of CEO. "We have much to do," he told James. "Let's expedite the transfer." My mother followed, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. Sophia lingered only long enough to glance at me, her smirk widening as she whispered, "I'll take your office. It has the better view." When they were gone, I sat there, clutching the envelope, my nails digging into the paper. James avoided my eyes as he gathered his files. "I'm sorry, Catherine," he said softly. "Truly I am." And then he left me alone in that cavernous room, the weight of betrayal pressing down like a stone. Back at the house, things grew even worse. My father made it clear that my position at the company was terminated, effective immediately. My apartment, owned by Harrison Shipping, was no longer mine. My car, leased through the company, would be repossessed, and the house, the home where I had grown up, where every memory of my grandfather lived, was now, according to the will, Sophia's property. "You have 24 hours to leave," my father told me coldly. I tried to pack my belongings, but when my mother and Sophia found me in my room, they accused me of stealing. We fought over my suitcase, Sophia ripping it open, pulling out clothes, jewelry, even the pearl necklace my grandfather had given me for my 21st birthday. "This is mine now," she declared, holding it high like a trophy. Something inside me snapped. I clutched the photo of my grandfather and me at my college graduation, refusing to let go. "You can take everything else," I shouted, my voice breaking. "But not this." My father arrived moments later, his expression twisted with cold fury. "You had your chance to leave quietly," he said. Then his hand fisted in my hair, and he dragged me through the hallway, down the stairs, across the marble floor, as I screamed and clawed at his grip. Pain exploded across my scalp, my knees scraping against the ground. My mother and Sophia followed, their faces a mix of triumph and disdain. With one final yank, he threw me onto the driveway. Gravel cut into my palms as I caught myself, tears blinding my vision. My father stood over me, his voice devoid of feeling. "You are no longer welcome here. If you return, I'll have you arrested." My mother tossed a small purse beside me. "Your wallet and phone, that's all you get." Sophia lingered in the doorway, her smirk crueler than ever. "Goodbye, Catherine." The door slammed, and I was alone, shivering in the evening air, my entire life stolen, in a single day. But even as I stood there, humiliated and broken, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. My grandfather had not betrayed me. He had warned me. And somewhere, hidden within his words and the letter he left me, was the truth that would bring all of them down. And that was the thought I carried with me into the night, unaware of the journey it was about to unleash. I sat on the edge of the motel bed, staring at the envelope my grandfather had left me. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, nothing more than a few sentences written in his bold, steady handwriting. Remember our special place, check your favorite book. Trust only Margaret. That was it. No explanations, no instructions, just a riddle left behind like breadcrumbs on a dark path. I read it again and again, my chest tightening with every repetition. My special place, my favorite book, Margaret. It didn't take me long to piece together what he meant. The special place could only be Lake Michigan, where we had spent countless Sundays side by side, fishing rods in hand. My favorite book was The Art of War, the one he had given me on my 16th birthday and told me to study like a manual for life. And Margaret, there was only one Margaret he could mean. Margaret Lewis, his executive assistant for over 20 years, the woman who knew him better than anyone besides me. I checked my phone. No calls from my family, not that I expected any, but there were messages from coworkers, confused and worried. What happened? Are you okay? I didn't respond. I couldn't. Right now, I had only one thought. I needed to find Margaret. When she answered my call, her voice was cautious, almost nervous. Catherine? Are you all right? Where are you? I swallowed hard, my throat raw from crying. I'm not all right. They've taken everything from me. Can we meet somewhere private? Please. There was a pause, then a firmness in her tone I hadn't heard before. Your father has forbidden employees from contacting you, but Edward was more than my boss. Meet me at Riverside Cafe in an hour. It's far enough from the office. No one will see us. I arrived still disheveled from the night before. My hair tangled from my father's grip, my eyes swollen from tears. Margaret's face paled when she saw me. My God, Catherine, what did they do to you? Her voice was full of outrage and sorrow. Over steaming cups of coffee, I told her everything. The will, the reading, the confrontation, being dragged out of my home like a criminal. Her hands shook as she pressed them to her lips. This isn't right. None of this is what Edward wanted. I leaned forward, desperate. Did you see his original will? She nodded immediately. Yes. Last year. He showed it to me himself. Everything was left to you, the company, the estate, the assets. He wanted to make sure there would be no confusion. Her eyes hardened. But 3 weeks before his death, your father brought in a new lawyer. Not James Thornton, but someone else. They were in his hospital room for hours. When they left, Edward seemed different, defeated. My stomach twisted. The pieces were starting to form a horrifying picture. My father had cornered him, pressured him, maybe even forced him. But why? How? Then I showed her the letter. She read it carefully, her brow furrowing. The special place is Lake Michigan, isn't it? And the book, yes, I know. He told me once that The Art of War held more than wisdom. He wasn't joking. She hesitated before adding. About a month before his hospitalization, Edward asked me to help him set up a safety deposit box at First National Bank. He didn't tell me what he put in it, but he said it was insurance against Thomas's ambitions. My pulse quickened. Did he give you a key? She shook her head. Number, he only said. Katie will know where to find it. I didn't need to think twice. The oak tree by Lake Michigan, the one where we had left messages when I was a child, tucking little notes into the hollow in the trunk. He must have hidden it there. That afternoon, I took the bus to the lake. The weather was gray, the wind sharp, but the shoreline looked exactly as it had on those Sunday mornings years ago. I walked to the tree, my heart hammering, and dropped to my knees at the base. Reaching into the hollow, my fingers brushed something cool and metallic. When I pulled it out, my throat tightened. A small brass key, tied to an old fishing lure. The very same lure we had used the day I caught my first fish. Tears blurred my vision. He had thought of everything. Even in his final days, when his body was failing him, his mind was still protecting me. He knew what they would try to do. And he had prepared me for it. That evening, I went to Margaret's house. She had a box waiting for me, filled with items Edward had entrusted to her, personal effects he didn't want left at the mercy of my parents. At the top was the leather-bound copy of The Art of War. My hands shook as I held it, running my fingers over the worn spine. Something about it felt heavier than it should. Carefully, I examined it until I found a hidden latch in the binding. With a soft click, a compartment opened. Inside was a folded note and a small USB drive. The note read, "For Catherine, the truth about Thomas's betrayal. Use it wisely, my dear." Margaret fetched her laptop. I plugged in the drive with trembling hands, and files appeared on the screen, dozens of audio recordings, each labeled by date. My breath caught as I opened the most recent one. Edward's weak voice filled the room. "I won't do it, Thomas. I won't betray Catherine." Then came my father's cold, measured reply. "You don't have a choice. Sign the new will or I'll expose the evidence. Everyone will believe me. The board, the authorities. Your precious Catherine will watch her reputation crumble. Those documents are fabricated and you know it," my grandfather said, his voice strained. "It doesn't matter what you know," my father sneered. "It matters what I can make others believe." I froze, every muscle in my body tightening. I opened another file, then another, each one more damning than the last. My father had forged financial documents, making it look like my grandfather had been embezzling for years. He had blackmailed him into changing the will, threatening to destroy his legacy if he refused. By the time the last file played, my hands were clenched so tightly my nails dug into my palms. My father hadn't just stolen my inheritance, he had blackmailed the man who had given him everything. And my grandfather, knowing the danger, had left me the truth hidden inside a book, a key by a tree, and the loyalty of one woman he trusted. The weight of it pressed down on me. I had proof, but proof wasn't enough. Not yet. My father had connections, influence, power. If I went after him recklessly, he would crush me. I looked at Margaret, my voice low but steady. "We can't do this alone. I need someone who can fight him. Someone who won't be intimidated." Margaret nodded slowly. "I know a lawyer, David Miller. He's not afraid of anyone." I tucked the USB drive into my pocket, the key into my purse, and closed my hand around the worn leather of The Art of War. For the first time since my grandfather's death, I felt something burn inside me stronger than grief. Determination. The clues had led me here, and now I had the weapon I needed to strike back. But little did I know, the war for Harrison Shipping was only beginning, and my father would not surrender without destroying everything in his path. The night I listened to my father's threats on those recordings, I barely slept. His voice echoed in my head, sharp and venomous, promising to destroy my grandfather if he didn't surrender. Each word burned itself into me until I couldn't tell if my pulse was racing from anger or fear. By dawn, I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't face him alone. I needed someone strong enough to go against him, someone who understood the legal and financial battlefield he had turned my life into. That was when Margaret gave me the name, David Miller. David wasn't just any attorney. He had a reputation in Chicago for being the man you called when you were desperate, when you were standing against people with too much power and too much money. He was relentless, unflinching, and he didn't scare easily. Margaret had known him for years through professional circles and assured me he was exactly the kind of ally I needed. Walking into his downtown office for the first time, I felt like an imposter. My clothes were rumpled from living out of a single suitcase, my hair still recovering from the brutal way my father had dragged me across the floor. But David didn't seem to care about appearances. He studied me with sharp eyes as I laid the evidence before him, the USB drive, the original will from the bank deposit box, the documents proving my father's embezzlement. When he finished reviewing everything, he leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "This is explosive," he said finally. "Fraud, coercion, embezzlement. Your father has committed multiple felonies, and if this holds up in court, he could spend years in prison." My throat tightened, but I forced myself to speak. "And the will?" Can we overturn it? David nodded. Yes, the original will is valid, and the new one was signed under duress. Add to that the evidence of forged documents, and you don't just have a case, you have the truth. But Catherine, you need to be prepared. Your father won't go down quietly. Men like him rarely do. A fire flared in me then, stronger than fear. I'm not afraid of him anymore, I said, though the tremor in my hands betrayed me. He dragged me by my hair and threw me onto the street. He tried to erase me. I want him to face the consequences of everything he's done. David gave me a long look, as if measuring my resolve, then nodded. All right, then we build this case brick by brick. No mistakes, no loose ends. The next 2 weeks were a blur of strategy and investigation. David and his team pored over every document, every transfer, every piece of evidence I had collected. We brought in a forensic accountant who traced the embezzled funds through shell companies and offshore accounts, each false invoice another nail in my father's coffin. At the same time, we reached out to my grandfather's doctors. One by one, they gave sworn statements about his condition in those final weeks. They testified to his weakened state, his compromised judgment, the heavy medications he had been prescribed. Some even admitted they had witnessed my father pressuring him, raising his voice, closing the door when I wasn't allowed inside. Margaret provided her own testimony, describing the day the new lawyer appeared, the change in my grandfather's demeanor, the conversations she overheard about insurance against Thomas's ambitions. Her loyalty to my grandfather was unshakable, and it gave me strength knowing she was by my side. Every night, I sat at my borrowed desk in Margaret's home, piecing together timelines, reviewing files, trying to connect every dot. My grandfather's words rang in my ears. Remember our lake, remember your book. He had left me everything I needed, but it was up to me to use it. Still, fear haunted me. My father had connections in the board, in the city, even in law enforcement. More than once, I caught myself wondering if he would send someone after me, if a knock on the door would bring more than just a neighbor. David warned me to be cautious, to keep my whereabouts private, to trust no one except those already in our circle. The more evidence we uncovered, the clearer the picture became. My father had been siphoning money from Harrison Shipping for years, millions of dollars quietly disappearing into hidden accounts, all while he positioned himself as the loyal CFO. When my grandfather began to suspect, he fabricated evidence to make it look like Edward had been the one embezzling. Then, with the weight of that false evidence, he coerced him into changing the will, securing his power, and setting the stage to crown Sophia as the new face of the company. But Edward had been smarter. He had recorded the threats, hidden the real will, left me a map of clues only I could follow. He had known this day would come. The final step was reaching out to the board. Carefully, quietly, I began contacting members I knew respected me, people who had worked alongside me for years, who had seen my dedication firsthand. I didn't reveal everything yet, but I planted seeds of doubt about the company's current direction, arranging for a special board meeting under the guise of discussing operations. When I told David what I had done, he smiled for the first time since we'd met. "Smart," he said. "If you can turn the board before we present the evidence, it won't just be a legal victory, it'll be a coup." As the date of the meeting drew closer, my nerves hardened into something else: resolve. I was no longer the girl sobbing on a motel bed, clutching a letter. I was my grandfather's granddaughter, the one he had trained, the one he had trusted, and I was ready to fight. The morning of the meeting dawned bright and clear, a cruel contrast to the storm I was about to unleash. I dressed carefully in a suit David had helped me buy, simple but sharp, a symbol of the authority I was reclaiming. As I stood before the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back. She was stronger, sharper, her eyes carrying the weight of betrayal but also the fire of justice. "Are you ready for this?" David asked as we walked into the gleaming lobby of Harrison Tower. I straightened my shoulders. "I've been ready since the night they threw me out." What I didn't tell him was that beneath the steel of my voice, my heart was racing. I knew that once I walked into that boardroom, there would be no turning back. My father would fight with everything he had left. And I had to be ready to meet him head on, armed not with rage, but with the truth. The stage was set, the evidence assembled, the allies gathered. All that remained was to face him in the one place he thought he was untouchable, his throne. And as I stepped into the elevator that would take me to the top floor, I could almost hear my grandfather's voice in my head. In the midst of chaos, there is also opportunity. The chaos was coming, and I was ready. The morning of the board meeting felt like stepping onto a battlefield. I had slept no more than 2 hours, my body wired with anticipation and fear. But when I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw someone else staring back. Not the girl who had been dragged out of her home by her hair, not the granddaughter sobbing in a motel with nothing left, but a woman ready to fight. My suit was sharp, my hair pulled back, my eyes steady. This was the day everything changed. David walked beside me as we entered Harrison Tower. The polished marble floors, the familiar hum of the elevators, the scent of expensive cologne and coffee, it had once been the rhythm of my daily life. Now it felt like enemy territory. My heart pounded as we approached the security desk. Thomas, the guard who had known me since my first internship, looked startled when he saw me. "Miss Harrison, I thought—" He hesitated, clearly torn. I smiled faintly, calm but firm. "Don't worry, Thomas. I'm exactly where I need to be." Before he could say more, Margaret appeared with her access badge. "She's expected," she said with authority, sliding the card through the scanner. Thomas nodded quickly and let us pass. As the elevator doors closed, Margaret turned to me and squeezed my hand. "They know something's coming. Your father has been locked in a private meeting with Sophia all morning. But they have no idea what you're about to drop on them." My stomach nodded, but I lifted my chin. "Good. Let them be blindsided." The elevator dinged on the executive floor, and suddenly, every eye was on me as I walked through the glass doors of the boardroom. The room was almost full. 10 of the 12 board members, senior executives, and at the head of the table, my father. Sophia sat next to him, her arms crossed, her face painted with practiced boredom. The moment he saw me, my father's head snapped up. Shock flashed across his features, quickly replaced by fury. "What the hell is this?" his voice thundered. "Security! She's trespassing!" Walter Chen, the board chairman, stood before security could be called. "Sit down, Thomas," he said firmly. "We invited Catherine here today. There are serious matters that need to be addressed." A murmur rippled through the room. My father's face darkened. "This is outrageous! She has no standing here. She was terminated." I stepped forward, my heels clicking against the polished floor, my pulse steady. "About that termination, it was fraudulent. Just like the will you forced my grandfather to sign. Just like the lies you built your throne on." The room went silent. My father's eyes narrowed into slits. "Careful, Catherine." But I wasn't there to be careful. I was there to expose him. I nodded to David, who began handing folders to each board member. "In those files," David explained, "you'll find evidence of Thomas Harrison's misconduct, fraud, coercion, embezzlement, and proof that the most recent will of Edward Harrison is invalid." I watched as the board members opened the folders, their faces shifting from curiosity to shock to outrage. Pages of bank transfers, fabricated invoices, shell companies, a timeline of threats, recordings transcribed word for word. At last Margaret connected her laptop to the projector. The room filled with the sound of my grandfather's voice, weak but resolute. "I won't betray Catherine. She's the future of this company." And then my father's venomous reply, "You don't have a choice. Sign, or I'll ruin you. The board will believe me. The SEC will believe me. Your golden girl will watch your empire collapse." The silence that followed was crushing. My father's face drained of color, but he still tried to fight. "This is fabricated. Lies. She's desperate to steal what doesn't belong to her." "Is it?" I asked quietly. Then I gestured toward the door. 2 men in suits stepped inside, their badges glinting under the fluorescent lights. "Thomas Harrison, one of them announced. "We're with the SEC's Enforcement Division. We'd like to ask you some questions regarding suspected securities fraud and embezzlement." The board gasped. My father stood abruptly, his chair clattering backward. "You can't do this! I'm the CEO! This is my company!" Walter Chen's voice was ice. "Not anymore. Effective immediately, you are placed on administrative leave pending investigation. You will be escorted from this building after your conversation with the SEC. My father's gaze darted wildly around the room, searching for support, but none came. Even Sophia had pulled her chair back, her face pale. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Is this true?" He ignored her. Instead, he fixed his eyes on me. As the agents approached, he leaned close, his voice low and venomous. "You'll regret this. I'm still your father." I met his gaze steadily, unflinching. A real father doesn't destroy his own child's life. You lost that right the day you betrayed me." The agents took him by the arm. He resisted for a moment, then sagged, his once commanding figure reduced to something small, broken. I watched him leave. The man who had terrorized me now dragged out of the company he had tried to steal. The boardroom erupted in murmurs. Walter Chen cleared his throat, regaining order. His eyes softened when they met mine. "Catherine, your grandfather always said you had steel in your spine. Today, you proved him right. You will be reinstated immediately as COO, and until a formal succession plan is finalized, the board votes to appoint you interim CEO." I swallowed hard, emotion swelling in my chest, but I forced myself to nod. "Thank you. I won't let this company fall prey to corruption, not while I'm here." When the meeting adjourned, board members approached me one by one, shaking my hand, offering words of respect and relief. The tide had turned. I had won this battle. But the moment that stays burned into me is not the board's vote, not my father's removal, but the sight of Sophia. She lingered at the far end of the room, her expression unreadable, her hands twisting in her lap. When the others had gone, she finally looked at me. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I thought Grandpa just changed his mind." I believed them. Her voice cracked, and for the first time, I saw her not as my rival but as a pawn. A pawn my father had moved across the board with cruel precision. "We'll talk later," I said softly. "Right now, I have to steady the ship." But even as I spoke, I knew this wasn't over. My father wasn't a man who went quietly, and my mother's silence throughout the ordeal worried me. There were still battles ahead, battles that could shatter everything if I wasn't ready. And as I stood alone in the empty boardroom, staring at the chair my grandfather had once occupied, I understood that this showdown was just the beginning. Fallout is never immediate. It unravels in waves, and each one crashes harder than the last. The boardroom victory should have felt like closure, but as I walked out of Harrison Tower that day, I knew it was only the beginning. My father was in federal custody, my mother was silent in her complicity, and Sophia, once so smug and untouchable, was unraveling before my eyes. The empire my grandfather built had been saved from collapse, but my family, whatever was left of it, was in ashes. That night, I lay awake in the bedroom that had once been mine in the Harrison home. Walking back into that space had felt like stepping into a memory that didn't fit me anymore. My childhood trophies lined the shelves. Old photographs of Grandpa and me fishing at Lake Michigan still sat on the dresser. But the room felt cold, stripped of belonging. This was no longer my home, it was a stage where betrayal had been rehearsed and performed until the curtain fell. I was haunted by the sound of my father's voice in those recordings, his threats, his cruelty. And though justice was finally in motion, I couldn't shake the image of him leaning across the table in the boardroom, hissing that I would regret exposing him. His words clung to me like a curse. The days that followed were consumed by legal proceedings. David and his team filed motions to reinstate my grandfather's original will, submitting the evidence of coercion and fraud. The court moved swiftly given the mountain of proof, and within weeks, the fraudulent will was declared invalid. On paper, I was once again the heir to the Harrison fortune and controlling shareholder of Harrison Shipping. But winning in court didn't mend the wounds inside me. Money and power could be returned. Trust could not. My father was indicted on multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and coercion. The evidence against him was overwhelming: bank records, shell companies, and above all, the recordings of his threats. He was denied bail, his once commanding presence reduced to an orange jumpsuit and shackled wrists. I didn't attend every hearing, but the ones I did left me with a hollow ache. Watching him sit at the defendant's table, avoiding my gaze, I felt both vindication and grief. This was my father. This was the man who had carried me on his shoulders as a child, who had tucked me into bed, who had taught me how to ride a bike. And now, he was the man who had dragged me by my hair across the floor, who had stolen my home, my inheritance, and nearly my future. Both versions of him lived in my memory, and reconciling them was impossible. My mother's downfall came quieter, like everything about her. When prosecutors discovered her involvement in hiding documents and enabling my father's schemes, she was offered a plea deal in exchange for testimony. She accepted, of course. Always pragmatic, always self-preserving. She avoided prison, but her reputation in Chicago society shattered overnight. Invitations stopped coming. Her friends abandoned her. She fled to Florida under the guise of starting over. Occasionally, she sent me emails, half apologies, half excuses. I read them, but rarely replied. Her words felt empty, like her carefully practiced smiles. Sophia was the hardest to face. After the boardroom confrontation, she retreated into herself. Gone was the smirking socialite who thrived on attention and luxury. She moved into a small apartment downtown, a stark contrast to the mansion she had once flaunted. When we finally sat down for dinner a month later, she admitted the truth with tears streaking her face. "I didn't know, Catherine. They told me Grandpa thought you were too controlling, that he wanted me to have a chance. I wanted to believe it, because I was jealous of you, of what you had with him." Her confession stung, but it also cracked something open in me. For the first time, I saw her not as the enemy but as another victim of our parents' manipulation. She had been their pawn, their golden child used to cut me down. I told her she could work at the company, but only if she earned her place. "No favors," I said firmly. "You'll start at the bottom, like I did." To my surprise, she agreed. And slowly, as weeks turned into months, she began to show glimmers of growth. For once in her life, she was trying. But rebuilding trust wasn't just about family, it was about myself. I was plagued by nightmares, waking in the dark with the sensation of my father's hand gripping my hair, the scrape of marble against my knees, the humiliation of being thrown out like garbage. I realized that while I had won the war for the company, the scars of betrayal ran deeper than any courtroom victory could heal. That was when I began seeing Dr. Caroline Foster, a therapist who specialized in family trauma. Sitting in her softly lit office, I unpacked the chaos of the past months. The grief of losing my grandfather, the rage at my father, the ache of my mother's abandonment, the confusion about Sophia. "What hurts most," I confessed one afternoon, "isn't the money or even the company, it's that they could do this to me at all, that our blood meant so little." Dr. Foster nodded gently. "Family is not defined by blood, Catherine. It's defined by choices. Your parents and sister made theirs. Now you get to choose who you let into your circle." Her words settled into me like a seed. Over time, I began to see the truth of them. My real family wasn't just the one I had been born into. It was Margaret, who had risked everything to protect my grandfather's secrets and to protect me. It was David, who had stood by me when I had nothing, who had believed in me when my own blood didn't. It was Walter Chen and the board members who had reinstated me with respect, not pity. And slowly, painfully, it was Sophia too, trying for the first time to build a life not on the backs of others but on her own effort. Yet even as I began to find strength in this chosen family, I knew the story wasn't finished. My father's trial loomed on the horizon, and with it the possibility of more secrets dragged into the light. My mother's testimony would make headlines. The media was circling, hungry for every detail of the Harrison scandal. Harrison Shipping was stronger under my leadership, But its reputation had been bruised, and I had to fight every day to prove we were more than the betrayal that had rocked our foundations. The fallout had reshaped everything I thought I knew. I had lost the illusion of family, but in its place, I had found resilience, truth, and a new kind of loyalty. Still, at night, when the city lights flickered outside my window and silence settled over the house, I felt the weight of what was still unfinished. My father's voice lingered in my mind, his threat hanging like a shadow. I had taken back the company, I had uncovered the truth, but I couldn't shake the sense that the battle was not truly over. And as the date of his trial crept closer, I braced myself. Because sometimes, the fiercest battles aren't fought in boardrooms or courtrooms, but inside the fragile bonds of what's left of a family. Closure doesn't arrive like a door slamming shut. It comes in fragments, in quiet moments when you realize the pain has shifted into something else, something lighter, something you can carry without it crushing you. For months after my father's arrest, I thought closure would come in the courtroom, in seeing him sentenced, in hearing a judge deliver the final word. But the truth is, the real closure came in the silence that followed, when I stood alone in the spaces my grandfather had once filled, and understood that I had survived. The day of the sentencing, I sat in the back of the courtroom, my heart heavy but steady. My father sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, smaller somehow, stripped of the arrogance that had once filled entire rooms. When the judge announced 8 years in prison for fraud, embezzlement, and coercion, he didn't look at me, not once. I thought I might feel triumph, some great wave of satisfaction. Instead, all I felt was sorrow. Not for the man he had become, he had chosen his path, but for the father I had lost long before the trial. A father who might have loved me once, before resentment corroded everything. My mother wasn't there. She had already taken her plea deal and moved to Florida. The emails she sent me continued, sometimes apologies, sometimes defenses, sometimes silence. I didn't respond. Forgiveness wasn't something I could give her, not yet. Maybe not ever. Sophia, though, was different. She came to me weeks later, standing awkwardly in my office at Harrison Shipping, her hands twisting nervously. "I want to learn," she said softly. "Not to replace you, not to take anything. I want to understand what Grandpa saw in all of this. I want to be worth something." I studied her carefully. For years I had only seen her as the spoiled child, the golden girl who had everything handed to her. But in that moment, I saw something new: humility, maybe even courage. I gave her an entry-level job in the marketing department, warning her she would be treated like anyone else. And to my surprise, she took it seriously. Slowly, awkwardly, but genuinely. Our relationship is fragile, but it's real. For the first time in our lives, we are building something on honesty rather than rivalry. As for me, I stepped into the role my grandfather always knew I was destined for. Leading Harrison Shipping wasn't just about profit margins or expansion plans. It was about carrying forward the values he had lived by: integrity, fairness, resilience. We modernized operations, expanded into new markets, and embraced sustainable practices that positioned us for the future. The company is thriving, but more importantly, it feels alive with purpose again. Yet the professional victories, as gratifying as they are, aren't the heart of this story. The real victory was personal. It was finding strength in the ashes of betrayal. It was realizing that family isn't always the people who share your blood, but the people who choose to stand beside you when everything else falls apart. For me, that family became Margaret, who never wavered in her loyalty; David, who fought for me when I had nothing left; and even Walter Chen, who reminded me that leadership is earned, not given. Healing didn't come quickly. The nights were the hardest, waking in cold sweats, remembering the scrape of marble on my knees, the humiliation of being cast out of my own home. But therapy helped, time helped, and slowly, I began to see those memories not as chains, but as scars, proof of what I had survived, reminders of what I would never allow again. On the anniversary of my grandfather's death, I visited his grave at Rose Hill Cemetery. The air was crisp, the leaves rustling overhead. I placed a single fishing lure beside the flowers and whispered, I kept my promise, Grandpa. The company is strong, the truth is out, and I am stronger than they ever imagined. In that quiet moment, I felt him with me, not in body, but in spirit, in the lessons he had left behind, in the strength he had planted in me long before I knew I would need it. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that betrayal doesn't define us. It wounds us, yes. It breaks us open in ways we never expect. But it also gives us the chance to rebuild not as who we were, but as who we are meant to become. My family tried to erase me, but in the end, they gave me the greatest gift, the chance to discover my own resilience, my own worth, my own voice. And maybe that's the lesson I want to leave you with. We don't get to choose what others do to us. We don't get to stop the betrayals, the losses, the heartbreaks. But we do get to choose what comes next. We can let it destroy us, or we can use it as the fire that forges us into something stronger. So if you've ever been betrayed, if you've ever felt the sting of being cast aside by people you trusted, know this. You are not alone, and you are stronger than you think. If my story resonates with you, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of resilience and redemption. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments because your stories matter too. And I'll leave you with this question. Have you ever faced a betrayal that forced you to redefine what family means? What did you discover about yourself in the process?